Hello YouTube, welcome to my channel and welcome also to my very first YouTube video. In this video I'm going to show you how to build a React Native Turbo module specifically for iOS in this video. I'm planning to do another one for Android. But I really hope you guys enjoy it and please let me know down in the comments what you guys think of it, provide feedback, things I can improve and anything else you have on your mind. So yeah, without more intro, please enjoy this tutorial. Now, if you don't know what's a turbo module, I'm going to briefly explain it. It is just a way of how you would bridge usually API, like platform-specific APIs from iOS and Android to JavaScript. It just basically allows you to call functions from iOS and Android, and through these functions, usually you would expose APIs. And turbo modules are relatively new. It's just the way of how you create like native modules in the new architecture. In the old architecture, they used to be called just native modules, but now they're called turbo modules. And yeah, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to be packaging this turbo module inside a React Native library. And in order to get started, I'm going to call a script, which is called npx create React Native library. All right. Now, I'm going to pass to this script like the React Native showcase, and that's how it would look like. Just npx create React Native library at latest React Native showcase. React Native showcase here is just going to be the name of the directory. So let's just hit enter and it's going to prompt us a couple of stuff. First, going to ask us about the name of the npm package, and by default, it's going to use the first argument that we passed. And yeah, I'm going to keep it. The reason I named it React Native Showcase is just because I'm showcasing here the turbo modules, but you could really name it whatever library you want to create, like React Native Camera, React Native Notification, or whatever you want. Next, ask about the description of the package. So I'm just gonna add like it's just showcase for turbo modules, right? You can add in whatever you want. Then it asks about the author, the email of the author, the GitHub of the author, and then that's for the URL of the repository. By default, it just adds the name of the package to the like URL of the author's GitHub. It doesn't have to really exist. You can create it if you want later on. Finally, and that's the kind of interesting part, is it asks you what type of library do you want to develop. Now you can create a JavaScript only library if you don't want to do anything like platform specific, or next it's like native module. But as I said, native module is how you would do it in the old architecture, but now React Native is moving to the new architecture, so we don't want to limit ourselves to that. We're not creating a view. We are creating a turbo module. And the interesting part here is we can also create a turbo module with backward compatibility. What that means is that since turbo module is for the new architecture, so if an app did not enable new architecture, it's still on the old architecture, we can provide a backward compatibility to it, right? So in this case, it works for new and old architectures. And that's what we're going to choose. So just hit enter. Finally, it asks us about the language we're going to use. Now, I'm going to choose Kotlin and Objective-C. You can choose Java and Objective-C if you want. Unfortunately, in this script, there's no Swift at the moment for iOS, but for now, I'm going to choose Kotlin and Objective-C, and now it's going to set up the library for us. Now, I just want to make this clear that in this video, I'm going to do only the iOS part, and in a later video, the one after this, hopefully I'm going to tackle Android. So now what's happening is creating the library, and the nice thing about this like utility create React Native library is that it creates also an example app. All right, so now it tells us that you can cd to this library, React Native showcase, and you can run yarn just to kind of install all of the dependencies. Now, when this is done, we actually need to enable the new architecture on in our example app. As I said, the library comes with an example app, and that's just to help you iterate on your library. Like as you edit your library, you can test it in the example app. So let's go into the example app, and I'm going to add in a script in the package.json, and that is just to help me um, enable the new architecture. And the way you would enable the new architecture in the React Native project is when you run pod install, which installs the pods for iOS, you need to add in a environment variable which is called rct new arc enabled, and set that to 1. And next you can do npx pod install. npx pod install is again just an npx script that helps you run pod install. You don't have to go to iOS and then run pod install. You can it just runs it for you. And with that added, let's run yarn pod, right? So as I said, what this does now is going to enable the new architecture and install the pods. So with that, the new architecture should be enabled for us. Interesting, that's done. Let's just run the app just to make sure that everything is running smoothly, right? React Native, and that's how you would run like on iOS npx React Native run -iOS. And optionally, you can add in the UDID of the device. I just added so that it always opens up this device. Now, there's an error, and usually this is kind of, it happens with me sometimes. So let me show you what is. I hope that that's the issue, is that here in .xcode, you need to kind of go inside the example directory. Oh, so let me just explain that I'm using NeoVim here. So I hope this is not confusing for you guys. You can open up the project in whatever editor you want. I'm using NeoVim. But where I'm at currently is just in my desktop, in the library that we created, and in the example directory. All right. And inside that, I'm going into iOS, the iOS directory, and there's .xcode.end.local. And here it expects the location of node. I hope this doesn't like happen with you, like it doesn't really happen with everyone. But in this case, you just say which node, like you just find the location of node and add it there. All right. It's a nasty one, like happens sometimes, but once you know what's the issue, like should be really fine. And now if we run the app once again and build it, hopefully it's going to be fine. Until that's done, let's just take a look at what's going on. Let's open up our directory. As I said, it created the library for us with an example folder. And what we're interested in is this source directory, all right? So we need to edit this native showcase.ts that was generated for us. In here, in this spec, like this object, for example, or like between this curly braces, actually, yeah, just checking if it failed or not. I hope it's working fine. Yeah, okay, I guess the app is opening now. Okay, so it's fine. Yeah, so as I mentioned, in order to like say what functions our libraries implement, we need to define them here inside the source directory, inside the native showcase. And I'm going to delete this multiply, and I'm going to add in my own functions that I would like to showcase here. I'm going to add a reverse string, right? And it's only a function that takes in a string called str and returns a string. Takes a primitive input, returns a primitive output, right? Next, I'm going to show you how to return arrays, like an array of numbers, for example. So get number returns an array of number. And let's do objects, right? Get object is a function that return a key of string and a value of string. What's the issue? This should be a colon. Yeah. Now, what I prefer to, like when I want to define an object that has key strings and key values, I prefer to use this way in TypeScript, but unfortunately this doesn't work, all right? So we're going to stick with this version. And when I say this doesn't work, I'm going to explain like what about it doesn't work. I'm going to explain that a bit later. And let's also do promises, right? Let's show off like how promises, that you can also do promises. So this is a function that returns a, a promise of a number, all right? And finally, let's do callbacks. I'm going to call this call me later because I have no better name. It's a function that returns nothing, but it accepts two functions, right? One called success callback and failure callback. Okay, so like this is just kind of showcasing different stuff. So call me later is like just shows the callback kind of way of doing stuff. You know, in lots of libraries, you could like call a function that takes some time, and then you pass it a success callback or a failure callback, and depending if it succeeded, it calls one or the other. And with promises, also another thing that is very common. You do something, it takes some time, you want to use async await or like then and dot catch, and just object, arrays, and a primitive. Next, what we want is we want to change the entry point of our library. If we check the package.json, you notice that the entry point is the index file, all right? React Native, it's source index, which is this one. So let's change this one. Now, the very first like kind of 23 lines, these are really all just boilerplate, all right? The only thing that this is doing is it's defining an error, and if it was not, it tries to get the module, right? And if it was successful in finding the module, it returns it. If not, it just defines a proxy that whenever you try to access any property, it just throws the error to let the user that when you install the library, you didn't install it correctly, right? So this is really just boilerplate. And now we need to, let's delete this multiply function and add in our own functions. One thing that I want to do, this showcase is our module. This is what we are implementing, okay? Now I just want to add a type to it, just to make, add in like, really just types to it, so it's easier for us to use it. I'm assigning the type of spec, and this spec is from this file, native showcase. Here we are exporting the interface, which is called spec, which defines these methods, all right? So that's all I'm doing. I'm assigning it this type. Finally, I'm going to export all of the functions from the module, right? Get object, get numbers, call me later, promise number, and reverse string. And finally, to be able to test that, we're going to go to the example source app.tsx, and now we have an error because there's no longer this multiply function that was implemented earlier. Now we have our own functions. Let's import them. Reverse string, promise number, call me later, get numbers, and get object. And let's remove the code that's there, and let's add in our functions. But let's add in a button to kind of invoke each one of them. Let's do reverse string, and in the onPress, what we're going to do is we are going to log, right, the result of reverse string, and I'm going to pass it the string reverse string to reverse it. And then we are going to create another one and call it get numbers, and we are just going to log get numbers, and then let's do get object, get object, and then let's do there's a typo there, but promise, right? And here we're going to do the promise number. Now, in order to use async await, the function needs to be asynchronous. And now we can do const x or like value equals to await promised number. Let's pass in 5, and then we can say promised value is, let's add in here, value, and up expected 0 argument but got 1. Let's see what we defined it as. Native showcase. Yeah, so I want this promise number to actually take in a number and return that as a promise. So that's why I want to take a number and return a number. And then finally, we're going to do the callbacks. Okay, let's remove the async. Let's do call me later, and let's do log success, and let's do another one which is failure, right? So we are passing a success callback and a failure callback. And with that, we have our app basically. Let's refresh, because we should see some like the buttons. Yeah, that's nice. Let's just, for styling purposes, add in a gap of 8 just to kind of space them out. And let's fix this typo, get object. And let's try and call it. Yeah, we get an error. It's not working, and the app basically is kind of not unresponsive anymore. So let's fix that. In order to implement these now, what you guys need to do is you need to go to the React Native Showcase, iOS, oh no, example. You want to go to the example app that's inside the React Native Showcase, and then iOS, and then click on the .xc workspace. Okay, and we're going to do our coding, like the coding of the iOS module in Xcode. You don't have to if you are using like if you are developing on macOS and you can't really test your module on iOS, then you can just try to code it in VS Code or whatever. But it's recommended to use Xcode, of course, for iOS development. So what we're going to edit is, so here's the directory of the library. There's this iOS directory, and there's these two files, showcase.h and showcase.m. The .h is the header file, and the .m is the implementation file. All right, so in order to find these, you open the XC workspace, and then you click on pods, and then development pods. Somewhere here, you should find your library. So if I search for React Native Showcase, okay, so here it is, I'll find the header file. Now, actually, you don't need to change anything about the header file. All right, the header file can stay as it is. It's all good. Now, one thing to kind of let you know about currently is you see this interface, the spec that we created. That's actually useful. Like, it's not just about types. It's not about TypeScript and getting autocomplete in the editor. The reason we actually defined this is because the turbo modules in the new architecture generates code, and it does that through something called CodeGen, which generates code basically. And what it does is that it takes your interface, your specification, and it generates native code, right? It creates a protocol on iOS and an abstract class on Android. And the reason it does that is to ensure type safety, right? Because these are the functions or the methods you are specifying that you want to implement. And in order to make sure that the inputs and the outputs that these functions or methods are returning are correct, it does that through CodeGen. And let's actually see what did this CodeGen generate. If you open this header file, you notice this native showcase spec, right? Now, if you press Command and left click, you're going to see here that it has a multiply, right? but so there isn't our function that we define. And that is because we did not invoke CodeGen, right? Like you kind of need to invoke this generation of code. And the way you would do that is you run pod install. So let's do that using our utility script that we defined, yarn pod. And as you can see, now our functions are defined. It says here that the files changed, you want to read from disk or keep Xcode version, let's read from disk. Things that happened when we generated. And now you can see these are all the functions that were generated for us, which is, I mean, just perfect. And now if we go to the implementation file, you're going to get an warning. It says that this class, which is our module in iOS, does not conform to the protocol because the CodeGen created this protocol and we are not implementing these. So let's fix that by adding this implementation. And first of all, let's remove the old multiply function that was in the example app. And now let's do let's now do the functions, and we can start with the call me later, right? Now, in order to call one of the callbacks, for example, the success or the failure, all you need to do is really just call it like that. As simple as that, you know. Whenever you want, you just call it. Now we're going to get an error currently because it expects an argument. Now, even though we didn't specify that it requires an argument, so in case it doesn't, you just pass in an empty array, all right? And that's how you do it in Objective-C, all right? You use this add symbol and then an empty braces, right? And if you want to supply arguments, you just pass them in, but since we have nothing, we don't pass them. Now, we don't really want to call them like this together. We're going to call them, we're going to get a Boolean, a true or false, just randomly. And if it's true, we're going to call the fail success. If it's false, we're going to call the failure, just to kind of just switch it, you know, kind of, and not call both. So let's define a Boolean called random. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use the arc for random uniform. And this, so what we're saying here is give me like a random number from 0 to 1, right? Like with 2, like kind of like a upper bound of 2. So it's like 0 and 1. And I'm going to say equals 0. So if it's going to be 0 or 1, then if it's 0, it's going to return true. If it's 1, it's going to return false. So we get a random Boolean. And then we want to call the, just to kind of, usually with callbacks, you don't call them directly. Usually you would do something that takes some time and then you call them. So let's just simulate that with a kind of the Objective-C way of doing set timeout, right? You call this dispatch after, and you pass in like the now and then how much delay you want, and you put the delay in seconds. So I want 2 seconds, and then inside here I'm going to do whatever I want after the time has passed. So here I want to say if random, I want to call the success, and else I'm going to call the failure. Now, one thing that may look a bit weird is this syntax, right? Like this kind of caret and then opening curly braces. That's just the way you would define an anonymous function in Objective-C, or a lambda kind of. All right, and with that, we finished call me later. And now let's do the get numbers. And in here, this expects us to return an array of NS numbers. And if you see these stars, it's literally just a pointer, and that's how you do it in Objective-C. You usually use pointers for objects like NS number, NS arrays are classes basically. So in here, we're going to define an NS mutable array of NS number, right? and we're going to call this numbers array. And the way we create that is by calling NSMutable array. Now this may also look weird, but that's just Objective-C syntax to kind of calling class methods and class static methods. So array is a static. So what I did here is I just pressed like to kind of go to the definition of it, and as you can see, the plus mean here it's a class instance, like it's an a class method. So it's a method that's called on the class, not on an instance of the class. And this instance type means that this returns an instance of this type. Okay, so what this is doing is just creating an NSMutable array. And now let's go and do a for loop and do int I equals 0. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to just loop from 0 to 10, add them inside the numbers array and return it, just as simple as that. So from I less than 10 and plus plus I, and then the way you would add it is you would say numbers array add object, and then you do this a bit weird thing, right? Let me just return numbers array. What we're doing here is you may like this may look weird, the add and then the parentheses and then the I, instead of just adding I directly. And that's because I is an integer, right? It's a primitive type integer, but it's expecting here an NS number. NS number is a class, right? So it's an object. And in order to convert this integer to an NS number, that's how you do it. You just wrap it in parentheses and add an add before it. And with that, we're done with the get numbers. Fine, now get object. It's kind of similar to the one above. We create a NSMutable dictionary and we call it object, and then NSMutable dictionary and dictionary. Again, this is just a static method on the NSMutable dictionary class to create a dictionary. And then let's return this object. And in here, we are going to call the method, let's object, set object, okay? And in here, you set the key and the value, right? So you can say result and then success. And again, this add may look weird, but it's just used a lot in Objective-C. And that's how you would define a string, right? You would put the add sign and then quotes and then whatever string you want inside it. Don't forget the semicolons, right? Object. Finally, let's do the promise number. And all we're going to do is you get the resolve and the reject parameters. And you can either resolve the promise or reject the promise. In our case, we're just going to resolve the promise with the value that was passed in from the user. But this resolve function expects an object, and value here is a primitive double type. So again, in order to convert this, from a double to an object type, we add in the at with the parentheses. But just to kind of make it just not happen that instantly, because usually promises take some time, just to simulate that it's taking some time, let's copy in the set timeout equivalent of Objective-C and then call resolve after 2 seconds. And finally, let's do the reversed string. Now, in order to reverse the string, we are going to create a new string with the same length as the string that's passed in, and then kind of go in reverse order and add the characters to the string. So let's get the NS integer, NS unsigned integer, and call that length, and set that equal to the string length, right? So we're getting this length of the string, and then we are going to create an NSMutable string, and we're going to call that reversed string. and then ns mutable string, ns mutable string with capacity of length. Now again, string with capacity is a class method that takes in an argument of length and returns a new ns mutable string with this capacity. So we are creating this reverse string with a capacity of size length. Now let's return this reversed string just to remove this error. And now we need to just create a loop, right? ns integer I equals to length minus 1, I is greater than or equals 0, and then minus I. And in here we're going to say reverse string append format, right, at at and then %c, right, and we are going to pass in the str character at index I, right? Let's check that. Okay, so all we're doing basically is that we are appending the character, or like we're appending this string, and inside this string we are adding this %c, which is like the way you would like format strings, and c stands for character, and we are getting the character for this specific index using the method character at index. And finally we are returning this reverse string, and with that we're actually done, kind of. So let's run the app and check out our work, right? Now this should not take time. I mean, once we're done with this, we need to also check if it works for the old architecture. And we're going to check that in just a minute after we verify that this is working on the new architecture, right? So as you can see, it built it successfully. Let's call reverse string. We're going to see, I mean, as you can see here, when you run the app, there is this fabric true. I mean, it's kind of split into two lines, which means that the new architecture is enabled. Let's run reverse string. Nice, we get reverse string reversed, and then get number from 0 to 9, get object, nice, and then promise 1 2, we get this promise resolved, and then callback 1 2, and then we get failure. We can like run it a couple of times and see that we're gonna have, yeah, failure, 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 success, failure, failure, success, success. Now that's interesting. Now let's test that the app works with the old architecture, right? Because now it's working for the new architecture. And the way that we would test that is really just, we would remove, actually let me just not remove it, and let me just call this npx. So the way you would do it is just call npx pod install, but you would not pass in the rct new arch enabled, right? And now once you run that, it's going to turn off the new architecture basically and install the dependencies. All right, and it finished that. Let's read from disk, and now do yarn start and build again, right? Now let me tell you that this is going to fail basically, and in order to make it work, we need to edit a bit our code, our module, in order to make it work with the old architecture. But let's just confirm that and check by making the app not work basically. Let's see, and it's done and successfully built the app. So even though it successfully built the app, let's try and call the function reverse string. It says it cannot find the package, like the package doesn't seem to be linked, make sure to blah blah blah. And by the way, this is the error that we got because here, that was defined here. The package does not seem to be linked, make sure, and then you see, you get that. And that's because the library was not linked correctly. All right, so what do we need to do? we need to add macros to our method. Now, if you don't know what a macro is kind of a function, but instead of during runtime, the macro, what a macro does is it just adds code to your code, okay? And that's what a macro is. And we're going to add a couple of macros. So we need to wrap each function from the beginning until the brace that is here, right? We need to wrap it in parentheses. And for the commulator, for the callback, the name of the macro is RCT, RCT export method, okay? And then here it expects the method. We already have it. So that's how it would be. RCT export method, you add in the method, but the body of the method is outside of the macro, all right? And we would do the same thing for the promise number. So let's go ahead and copy this up. Let's copy it, go here and paste that. And at the end, let's add in here. And then what we need to do is, now we need to use the RCT export method for both the callback and the promise. But for the other ones, because they are synchronous, we need to use another macro. And it's just called RCT export synchronous tapped method. Okay, that's what it's called. Let's remove that. And yeah, and that. And then add in that. And yeah, I guess now it's fine. So the way you would do it is that you would do this RCT export synchronous type method. You would add in the type that this method is returning, and then the method, and then the body is outside. So let's do it again. Let's copy this here. Right. And then you remove this one and put the parentheses at the end. This is for get object. And then for these are done. Yeah, so this commulator, get number, get object, promise, and yeah, for reverse string, again, you add this in the beginning, you add a comma between the type and the name and the method signature, and then you add in a closing parentheses. And with that, let's run the app one more time. Now, technically, okay, so let me just quickly explain why we used RCT export synchronous start method for these, but RCT export method. Now, the reason is these three methods, they return something, right? And they need to happen synchronously. You call them, you return something, and then the code needs to continue. Because they return something and you wanted them to return it synchronously, you use the RCT export synchronous start method. But because promises and callbacks do not return anything and they are just invoke something later on, you just export them normally like this, our RCT export method. So now let's try it. Reverse string, nice, get number, get object, promise, callback. Takes 2 seconds. Here, success, call that a couple of times. And it should, okay, it's all success. Let's try it a bit more. Yeah, we get one failure. And yeah, so with that, we created a React Native Turbo module and implemented the iOS part of it. So as you can see here, we added these methods for the library, and it is working on both the old and the new architecture. And with that, we're done. I'm going to do Android hopefully in another video. All right, and now that we're done, I just want to close this by asking you, if you really like this video, just hit the like button, because then I'd know. If you don't, you can also hit the dislike button, that's also fine. But then I also know that it wasn't good. Also, if you're interested in knowing when I upload a new video, maybe hit the subscribe button too. And if there's something you'd be interested in seeing me do related to React Native or something like that, then let me know down in the comments what that is. And also, if you have any feedback, please let me know down in the comments. And thank you very much, and goodbye.